discuss the meaning of life, absurdism, and existentialism in Albert Camus' The Stranger. The protagonist of The Stranger, Marceau, is exactly what the title suggests, a stranger to society and even to himself, due to his indifference and lack of ambition. Although he would even lack the desire to tweet, as a victim of universe's attempts to rationalize the irrational, he would likely tweet something like this. At The Stranger, even if you don't play the game, you still lose. Hashtag meaningless existence, hashtag irrationality, hashtag absurd. Next slide. So The Stranger dealt with an absurd and irrational with a lack of a distinct identity and meaning. Therefore, I thought it was only fitting that today I'd bring an irrational combination to the discussion. So, although Oreos and orange juice do not equal the meaning of life, it is something that I thought really had no reason to be connected, and therefore I brought it today. But like Marceau, I found meaning throughout it. Therefore, I can show that some people actually like Oreos and orange juice. If you look it up, it's actually one of those weird combinations that people are guilty pleasures with. So this is kind of like Marceau, who kind of is enlightened throughout the process of the book. He kind of finds peace with the irrationality in the world. Also with the Oreos, the black and white pattern represent the clear rationalization that society has that they rely on for meaning. Next slide. So, although we may not choose to eat Oreos and orange juice regularly, we still make decisions every day. Many of us have good reasons for doing this or that, making this decision rather than that, choosing this path over another, or etc. There's often a point to these choices that we can identify, and sometimes have thought hard about. But is there a point to life as a whole? That is a question about the meaning of life. Though the question is notoriously hard to answer precisely, one way or another, it has been the main focus of many pieces of literature, art, and philosophy. Some philosophers have provided disheartening answers like life is suffering, and then it ends, or life is absurd and never gains any meaning. This scrutiny of life is exactly what I learned about this past weekend, when I had the pleasure of sitting in on a college lecture called Meaning of Life with Professor Matthias Riese. During the class, students discussed Death and the Afterlife by Samuel Scheffler, and the primary question of, if the afterlife is not present, is there any meaning to our current actions at all? Though the class also discussed broader perspectives on philosophical question of what is the meaning of life, both pessimistic and optimistic viewpoints, today I want to focus on the viewpoint that life is meaningless and absurd, as articulated through Albert Camus' The Stranger. Next slide. In The Stranger, the lack of emotion and indifference that Marceau experiences leads to both his own insignificant existence and also his triumph over society, with his realization of death's inevitability and the irrationality and meaninglessness of the world in which he exists. Through Marceau's apathetic perspective on life and explicit lack of emotional feeling towards others, Camus asserts his own absurdist beliefs. Throughout the novel, Albert Camus elucidates Marceau's physical and mental entrapment as he awaits his own execution and challenges the chaplain's religious beliefs and rationalization of an irrational universe. Marceau, who usually shows extreme indifference, is enraged after the chaplain attempts to discuss religion, which leads to Marceau's own realizations about the inevitability of death and existentialism. Through the use of rhetorical questions, repetition, and fiery dialogue, Camus effectively demonstrates Marceau's physical struggle with his impending death and his own realization that human beings exist in a chaotic, purposeless world. Next slide. As one of the forefathers of existentialism, Albert Camus believed that the universe is irrational and purposeless, supporting the notion that life has no intrinsic meaning and our existences are definitively meaningless. Albert Camus is also one of the most influential writers in the absurdist movement. His writing is often from the perspective of an outsider as he observes and analyzes the human conditions. His work often reflects, and I quote, a deep interest in questions of guilt and innocence, often addressed in a manner which incites introspection within the reader. The absurdity of life and its inevitable ending is highlighted in the very famous opening lines of the novel. Quote, "Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I can't be sure." This alludes to the claim that life is engrossed by the absurd. He believes that the absurd, life being void of meaning, or man's inability to know what the meaning is, if it were to exist, was something that man should embrace. His other major works include The Plague, The Fall, and his pivotal essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, which detail his view regarding human existence and the true pursuit of happiness. A Frenchman who was born in Algeria, Camus often experienced concepts of exclusion, which he wrote so often about. Camus was also often highly critical of the French colonial regime's treatment of Algeria's Arab and indigenous inhabitants. Camus often said that Algeria affected him Algeria affected him as others feel pain in their lungs. Camus himself was a stranger, and so he was able to add an element of authenticity to the experiences he detailed. Also, as an atheist, Camus unreservedly questions the principle of a structured, God-created universe, arguing that the crisis of self could cause a man to commit philosophical suicide. choosing to believe in external sources that give life what he would describe as false meaning. He claimed that religion was the main culprit. If a man were to choose to believe in religion, that the meaning of life was to ascend to heaven or some similar afterlife, that he committed philosophical suicide by trying to escape the absurd. Next slide. The Stranger is an exemplification of Camus' absurdist style. As explained by Dr. Nana Sakaran, in The Stranger, Camus shows an absurd sensibility by creating a character who makes none of the normal assumptions about life, a man without social ambition, without belief in any religious or rational meaning in the universe. And then now I'm going to read an excerpt from the novel. It's on the handout. The chaplain looked at me with a kind of sadness. I now had my back flat against the wall, and light was streaming over my forehead. He muttered a few words I didn't catch, and abruptly asked if he could embrace me. No, I said. He turned and walked over to the wall and slowly ran his hand over it. Do you really love this earth as much at all? He murmured. I didn't answer. He stood there with his back to me for quite a long time. His presence was grating and oppressive. I was just about to tell him to go, to leave me alone, when all of a sudden, turning towards me, he burst out. No, I refuse to believe you. I know that, at one time or another, you've wished for another life. I said of course I had, but it didn't mean any more than wishing to be rich, to be able to swim faster, or to have a more nicely shaped mouth. It was all the same. But he stopped me, and wanted to know how I pictured this other life. Then I shouted at him, one where I could remember this life. And that's when I told him I've had enough. He wanted to talk to me about God again, but I went up to him and made one last attempt to explain to him that I only had a little time left, and I didn't want to waste it on God. He tried to change the subject by asking me why I was calling him Monsieur and not Father. That got me mad, and I told him he wasn't my father. He wasn't even on my side. Yes, my son, he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. I am on your side, but you have no way of knowing it, because your heart is blind. I shall pray for you. So this passage begins as the chaplain approaches Meursault in his prison cell, attempting to persuade Meursault to listen to the word of God and find solace in religion. Immediately, through the imagery of Meursault's behavior, it is evident that he is resistant to the idea of religion. His hesitance to answer, indifference towards the chaplain, and defensive body language emphasize how the idea of rationalizing the world around him through religion is, in his eyes, foolish and useless. While the chaplain represents religion and Meursault represents more absurdist thoughts, it is clear that the two clash with religion's inherent desire to explain and rationalize everything in the known world, and absurdism simply accepts the universe is chaotic and our existence in it is meaningless. Through Meursault's inner dialogue and dialogue with the chaplain, glimpses of this existential conflict can be seen. Meursault goes far enough to assert that the chaplain wasn't even sure he was alive because he was living like a dead man, while he says of himself, I was sure about me, about everything. Through this dialogue, it can be understood that the religion is a false facade to the ugly world in which we exist, giving false expectations and rationales to things that are simply unexplainable. As the chaplain and Meursault begin to escalate their verbal barrages, the chaplain's comment that Meursault's heart is blind causes Meursault to abandon his usual collected persona for a violent, enraged alter ego. Through this transformation, Meursault asks himself rhetorical questions that finally verbalize his own absurdist beliefs. Questions like, what did other people's deaths or a mother's love matter to me? Exemplifying Meursault's epiphany that nothing in life really matters. He realizes that everyone, even his own existence, is meaningless, as everyone meets the hand of death eventually, regardless of heroism or sin. Through the use of repetition of short phrases like, I had been right, I was still right, I was always right, Meursault affirms his own extreme beliefs. Next slide. The themes found in the novel The Stranger may also be found in the contemporary poem Sometimes I Don't Know If I'm Having a Feeling by Matthew Seigel. In the poem, Matthew Seigel elucidates the mental and physical entrapment of society as he contemplates his own existence through an ephemeral, out-of-body perspective. Through recalling his own detached experiences, Seigel attempts to put to words his indescribable feelings of existential despair while emphasizing his own meaningless existence in an irrational, irreverent universe. And now I'll be reading the poem. It's on the back of the handout. Sometimes I don't know if I'm having a feeling, so I check my phone or squint at the window with a serious look, like somebody in a movie, or a mother thinking about how time passes. Sometimes I'm not sure how to feel, so I think about a lot of things until I get an allergy attack. I take my antihistamine with beer. Thank you very much. Sleep like a cut under a Band-Aid, wake up on the stairs having missed the entire party. It was a real blast, I can tell. For all the vases are broken, the flowers twisted into crowns, for the young, drunk, and beautiful. I put one on and salute the moon, the lone face over me shining through the grates of the front door window. You have seen me like this before. Such a strange version of the person you thought you knew. Guess what? I'm strange to us both. It's like I'm not even me sometimes. Who am I? A question for the Lord, only to decide as she looks over my resume. Everything is different sometimes. Sometimes there is no hand on my shoulder, but my room, my apartment, my body are containers, and I am thusly contained. How easy to forget the obvious. The walls, blankets, sunlight, your love. So, as you can see, both The Stranger and Albert Camus' The Stranger, or both The Stranger and the poem, are centered around the experiences of being an outsider and dealing with themes like societal detachment and searching for meaning. Camus' protagonist, Marceau, experiences alienation due to his extreme indifference and despair as a result of the meaningless existence. In the novel, Marceau is detached from society through his own indifference and emotional isolation due to his belief that the world is irrational and purposeless, and his own existence is therefore meaningless. In the poem, the speaker finds himself as an observer of much of the world around him. The description of the observations makes it seem as if his consciousness is separate from his physical being, and that he has no real meaning in life as he tries to imitate the rest of society. The text focuses on the meaning of life in an irrational and purposeless world. In the poem, the speaker begins to question philosophical questions concerning their own existence. To end, let's take a look at another piece by Camus, titled The Myth of Sisyphus. Sorry, two slides. One more. Alright. To end, let's take a look at another piece by Camus' work titled The Myth of Sisyphus, that examines the Greek story of Sisyphus, who was punished for self-aggrandizing craftiness and deceitfulness by being forced to roll an immense boulder up a hill, only for it to roll down when it nears the top, repeating this action for eternity. The piece ends, quote, "The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Ultimately, upon finally accepting that life is purposeless, we are faced with the predicament of being a meaning-making creature in a meaningless universe. Although Camus' acknowledgement that the world is irrational, he implores us to accept it and live our lives to the fullest each and every day, not conforming to a collective rationalization of the universe. To be truly happy in a meaningless world, you must follow your desires and act in ways that give you your own purpose in life, and only then can we find the meaning of life."